This was Tesla's room for the last decade of his life, from about 1933 to 1943. You have hopefully a sense of how tiny it is and how tight the quarters were. He was a man of very few needs. Living in a hotel, he had all of his daily needs taken care of. When you think about it, as a bachelor his entire life, his bed was changed, his linens were cleaned. He'd go downstairs and eat in a restaurant. At the time, this was the most technically advanced hotel in the world, generating its own electricity. And the other part of it was that at the end of his life, he sort of, say, lost his mind to some extent and couldn't socialize with people and was able to only communicate with pigeons. And where else were there a lot of pigeons? But half a dozen blocks away from here, he would walk to Bryant Park and feed his pigeons and even have them perch on his windowsills here. One of the other significances of the room is that Tesla needed everything divisible by 3. And if you look at the door plate, the number is 3327, a number divisible by 3.
Like we were talking about earlier, it's interesting to be here in a corner room where he spent his time, and he, lacked that human connection in a lot of ways, and he found that with the pigeons. But at the same time, looking out the window, we see that you're in the middle of, one of the most busy and exciting cities in the world. So it's an interesting contrast, that you could look out and see all the activity and the action that's going on, and yet, despite your incredible, intuitive, creative mind, you just couldn't quite make that connection.
Right, and he can shut himself off too from the world. Right at his doorstep, you look out the window, and there's the Empire State Building, which was here when he was here.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of technology around him, and he was able to work alone as a recluse here, very much so. That's a little bit of a long story, and I'll try to synopsize it to some extent. Many years ago, I got interested in him through a friend of mine who is a writer. We from Canada, Toronto. Godfrey and myself would exchange short stories, and we build upon each other's story. He's written a lot of books himself and a lot of film scripts himself. And at that time, as I did throughout my entire adult life, work in the theater and worked on writing plays as one of the things. And I was footballing this idea around, what's a good subject for a play, basically? Who do we know that has a lot of conflict in his or her life, which fits theater? You have to have a lot of conflict. You just can't talk. You have to have two people going up against one another, or a person going up against nature, or going up against a machine or something like that. And he turned me on to Tesla, who was rather a unique character who had a life full of conflict. He had to go up against Edison, Westinghouse, J.P. Morgan, all the giants of the day, as well as to try to sell these ideas to people and have them believe, wait a minute, you're not that, we need this kind of thing. And doing that, he had to become a showman himself. In order to raise money for his projects, he would do all of these kinds of demonstrations right around the corner here in Madison Square Garden, for one, that kind of thing. So it became very much a story about a man in conflict with the world in many ways. What we look at his legacy, leaving us electricity, we wouldn't be surviving today without it. Let's think about going to a place in the world where there's no electricity.
Yeah, and on top of that, I feel like it seems like a very American story, even though, he was, unlike Edison, he was an immigrant, but that's like the American story. He came with barely anything in his pocket and an idea, and he was an incredible innovator. And like you're saying, bringing these ideas to people who it might be hard for them to even conceive it in a way,
Oh, in many ways, true. And he had to raise all his own money. And that put him in conflict, too, to the point where some of his ideas were just so outrageous that people didn't want to fund them. And the time that he came to America, it was a wild time for inventors. When you look at some of the things that were invented back there at the early part of the 20th century. So there was that kind of thing. But ultimately, what intrigued me the most, I think, was his humanitarian outlook on life and wanting to benefit mankind and give away electricity free, power free, that kind of thing, and as well as end war. He was a very much of a pacifist in that respect. So he had a lot of good things going for him, and left us a legacy of what we're doing right now. We're being shot on film that's being run by electricity or electrical batteries that without Tesla we would not have had. It will air on television, hopefully. Again, television was another invention of his.
Well, like we were discussing earlier, he was, definitely a man way before his time, and kind of in some ways like a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk. And then at the same time, you wouldn't have an iPhone without Tesla, and you wouldn't have an electric car without Tesla.
Yeah.
So it seems appropriate, that it's got his namesake.
Yeah, it's nice to see that when people say you wrote a book on Tesla, and we were both talking about it earlier, and they say, "Oh yeah, the guy who invented the car."
It's like, no, the other guy. It's the other guy, actually.
It's the other guy. He was serious, but it came down to that. I mean, most people that you say the name Tesla to, they think of the car, and they don't realize this wonderful, great humanitarian just wrote out of the history books, and it wasn't in a Tesla vehicle.
I mean, there's also the dynamic where everyone probably knows the name Edison. And so I think that that's a really interesting dynamic in that, in a way, every great man must have a nemesis of some sort.
The part of the fascinating thing about Edison, too, he was a publicist. And we're in a time now, how well you use the media to get your message across. And without going there, we had Edison, we had Westinghouse, we had J.P. Morgan, we had Vanderbilt, and so many other people that they knew how to manipulate the media of the day and sell themselves. Tesla was not into that until he realized there was a point where he had to adopt that kind of showmanship that we were talking about earlier, that kind of thing.
I was definitely drawn to the subject matter because he was kind of a modern day wizard, and he was operating on the edge of, scientific knowledge at the time, and almost in a kind of mystical way, that he was kind of foreseeing the future, and like Robert touched on, the idea of harnessing the power of nature for the betterment of mankind. Like a really unique individual, in the world. I mean, I can't think of. He stands apart from many other inventors in that way, and also his personal quirks and his journey, from childhood to the big city, and kind of how he staked his claim as best he could, with ideas that were almost again like hard for people of his time to grasp.
Right. As an illustrator too, a lot of your figures are dynamically energetic and show action. And looking at Tesla's life and kinds of things, we go back to the showmanship, and you capture that in the drawings. The ability of any number of these illustrations have action built into them. It's just not ideas. It's how to bring those ideas into movement, into a forward motion, and I think you did an incredible job in capturing those high points where different things in his life actually are moving objects.
Well, I appreciate that, and another thing we've talked about a lot is how looking at his patent drawings for all of his inventions. Just the act of kind of redrawing them and repurposing them for the book made you appreciate, one, that they're in and of themselves a work of art, and how, working through them, the kind of complex, abstract ideas that he was coming up with kind of became a lot more linear when you had the opportunity to see, point A to point B. And it gave it was a very kind of interesting window into his thinking.
Yeah, you saw there was a lot of fluidity in the way they moved and that kind of thing. I mean, they themselves hanging a set of some of the patterns on a wall as an art exhibit is kind of kind of invigorating and exciting in and of itself.
And I think that there was something where he really kept it all in his head until the point of execution.
Exactly.
Which is fascinating also. Yeah. It's,
he would formulate everything in his mind, and he himself felt that he wasn't much of an artist. He had a lot of trouble drawing technical drawings way back when he started out. He didn't consider that as one of his advantages.
And I think that the other person who comes to mind who had the ability to do such a thing was Mozart, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
he's in rarefied company, of course.
Indeed. Actually, there are a few fun facts. The first one, which I had known about, was his work on therapeutic high-frequency oscillators, and he was a close friend of Mark Twain's. And Mark Twain would come to his laboratories, and while Tesla would be conducting experiments. So one of the ones was with the oscillator, and he put Mark Twain on basically a platform and started giving him a little juice, and Mark Twain would say, more, 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 and it kept vibrating, and to the point where all of Mark Twain's insides were jostled, and he took a fast dash for the bathroom. This is one I had known about for some time. Another one that came up was, fun fact, was one of his demonstrations on robotic boats. And the people seeing it, the engineers, the electrical engineers, the scientists that were there, they scratched their heads, marveled at it, and didn't want to believe that there was electricity or whatever controlling it. They thought maybe he had a monkey inside the boat. But one of the ones that I hadn't known about while researching, and Owen and I were just actually talking about it, was helicopters. And the word flivver was a very funny sounding word to me. I hadn't heard it since I was a youngster, but that was attached to shoddy cars that were made and mass produced, and Tesla took that word flivver to denote what he invented was a helicopter. And if you look at the drawing of the helicopter in the patent, it's very humorous looking. But here's this pile of electronic devices and metal and whatnot, and this was the basis of his helicopter, which he called the flivver. So I found that kind of humorous to hear that word. It's a fun word.
The other thing that I found interesting, which, as I learned about it, kind of made sense, was his proclivities with regards to numbers and counting and neatness, and it kind of made sense in some ways. I can't help but think of Howard Hughes to a certain extent, in the sense of the way the mind works, to be able to hold these concepts, in such a high level of complexity in your mind, and then be able to translate them into the real world. I guess that might sometimes carry with it some other strange quirks.
Yeah, I mean, today we probably would call it obsessive compulsive in that respect, that everything, I mean, if he walked around a block, he couldn't walk around it once. He had to walk around it 3 times before he got to his destination. And he ate in elegant restaurants here, and he'd have to have a pile of napkins. And there'd have to be 18 napkins, which was divisible by 3. Or 3 cups of tea or something like that. It just, today, I mean, it was that kind of mind that just had to stay, it kept him rooted in that sense.
So the most challenging aspect of creating the illustrations I guess it was less of a challenge. It was a challenge in a positive way of bringing this story, which at least I was familiar with through a more historical and documentary style of storytelling, into a more kind of accessible and contemporary style, you know. And also, I feel like while Robert, you did such a great job with the complexity of the story and bringing it into a much more accessible and lively retelling. I think that the illustrations kind of hopefully brought a kind of a personality to the character of Tesla in a way which is kind of maybe lost when all you're seeing is a series of historical photographs or diagrams, as we were talking about. And also hopefully brings more of the sense of wonder back into the story as well, which he obviously was, was a driving force for him in a lot of ways.
Bringing it into a balance, which a lot of the books we've seen, a lot of the research, put him in his time where we think of scientists, or I shouldn't say we think of, but the way history has sort of erased a lot of people out of this. And I try to bring in, there's a film out recently called Hidden Figures, and it bears, I mean, this came out after the book, but in writing the book itself, I wanted to find out who beside Edison, who beside J.P. Morgan. There had to be other people, like the Hidden Figures movie we've recently seen. And it took me a long time to find people like Howard Latimer, who incidentally came from the town I grew up in, and I didn't know that. He invented the incandescent light bulb, but there was Edison ready to take the credit. Or Granville T. Woods, who's also an African American, who invented a communication electronic system that the conductor on a train could speak to the people at the back of the train, and it kept the safety features of the train. So it was a balance of, I want to find other people, not just the white people that were in history, but to balance it in that respect. Even there's a drawing of a young lady in there playing with an electric motor, which was from a photo that I had shot out at a Tesla event about a couple of years ago. So it was like, okay, let's bring some balance to the story. Let's humanize it in many other different ways than just, like you say, a figure out of history.
Yeah, and not just focus on the person with the best PR team.
Yeah, very much so. It was looking for that kind of balance, that humanity, and going, which other books don't.
Because I think it's something that's obviously, I mean, you can focus almost entirely on Tesla's work, but there's so much more to it in terms of his motivations and again his fascinating, unique personality. And
very much.
How does a person like this, so unique in history, come to be? And what drives him?
Another challenge in writing the book was myself having undergraduate degrees in math and physics. That was way in the back of my mind somewhere, and it was trying to refresh it and then relearn what I thought I knew, and then break it down elementally for somebody who's a beginner, and that was a hard challenge too.
Thanks. It worked for me. So. Being that it's a book for all ages, I think that dream big, and push yourself, whatever you're doing, to the limit as far as you can take it. See how far it is, because Tesla most certainly did that, and he just didn't stop. And he would do something, and when it was done, he'd move on to the next thing and keep pushing it and pushing it. Something that we've heard many times, I think, in life is fail again, and fail better. And I think that that's something that Tesla, continued in the face of some pretty big odds, continue to persevere and, to achieve his goals.
I think both of us as artists, recognize that very much so. I know working in the theater, you're constantly rejected. And when you have your successes, it's terrific. But it's that kind of a world built upon dreams. Act on your dreams. Uh, Never accept no. If you know in your mind, the other no, K-N-O-W versus N-O, that you have the right formula, the right workings, the right drawing, if you're truthful to yourself, don't accept that no and just keep pushing forward. And I think that altruistic idea of bringing peace and harmony and health and giving free electricity to the world is a strong motivator, because you realize how many people in the world don't have fresh water, don't have electricity. I mean, the whole, he was so tied to nature and the environment that the perseverance to perfect this planet was his ultimate goal. And I think all of the readers who read something like this should take away from it that just don't stop.
And I think, from the beginning of the story, from his childhood, and where he already started developing a lot of his ideas and things that things that would manifest, decades later, is, he was inspired by nature ultimately.
Yeah. Owen did a wonderful job cyclically to bring it back to that by the end of the book. It really works. And, yeah. So, in short, this is Owen's stunning cover.
Thank you. Robert's taken a very complex and at times technical story and distilled it into a really compelling tale about, again, a unique man. About this, and you know what's funny? Hey, without electricity, you wouldn't have that either. Electricity.
Why should somebody read this book? In many ways, as Owen noted, it takes those complex ideas and does bring it down to a level of I hesitate to use simplistic reading, but breaks the ideas down into manageable components to figure out what this guy was about, figure out and learn what he did in life, figure out the kinds of things that he left us with. And physics is not an easy subject. When we hear the word in school, many of us, unless we're really into science, shy away from taking a physics course. It's just too mind-boggling sometimes. So that's the hard part. But I think taking away from it, and we go back to, we can do what we want in life. Just don't stop. And I think that's what the message of the book is, that humanitarian message, as much as it is a story about this great man who seems to have written out of a lot of history books. And to be sure, there are a lot of books on him and a lot of good ones on him. They take a particular kind of avenue or presentation. The hard part about this was taking it all and distilling it for someone making an entry into his life for the first time.
Yeah, and I think that it's hopefully the illustrations, like the great story that you told, it's something that creates more of a character around Tesla, and you see who he was as a person, mm-hmm. and someone who, even though the story takes place in we're talking about a historical context, the ideas are just as fresh now.
Yeah, you think of all of the game shows that are on television. I want to be a big singer. I want to Got Talent or dance off. We're always rooting for the underdog, and goodness knows Tesla in his time was a complete underdog. It gives us someone to really root for.
Definitely.